Okay, folks, since we're running late, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. If that's okay. Welcome. Thank you for coming. We've got a lot of information, so want to get started. So this is immigration, national and local immigration issues, fact or fiction. So we're going to start with an overview of the U.S. immigration system, an extremely broad overview. Whenever you're talking about legal stuff, I'll just have to say I'm not a lawyer. This is literally the amount that I need to know to do my job at Minnesota Council of Churches. So take it with a grain of salt. This is just a broad overview. Don't make any important life decisions based on what I'm about to tell you.
Is it being recorded?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
So one framework for immigration that I found helpful is the Immigration Hotel by Virgil Webb, who's a professor at University of St. Thomas. It's a very strange hotel, but it's a metaphor that is kind of helpful. So he's got a Prezi online. You can Google it. So why do more work? I'm just going to use his Prezi. Okay, so these are the levels of the hotel. There will be an image later that spells them out, but just in case it's too small, here they are. Citizenship is the highest floor. That's what people born in the US have, so what people are probably most familiar with. Permanent residence, also known as someone having a green card. Refugee or refuge covers refugees and people who have been granted asylum. Non-immigrants, so people that are just here for a temporary time, for example, like study abroad students from overseas. Person seeking admission, and so we'll go into more detail. That one's kind of complicated. Unauthorized status, so people that are in the US but don't have permission from the government. And detention, which is the basement, not a great place to be. Okay, so here's the whole hotel. Citizenship is up at the top, detention is right there, and then the foundations. So unfortunately, our immigration system is on the foundations of racism, sexism, economics. We do have that little spot for refugees and family reunification. But there was a long time where you couldn't be naturalized as a US citizen if you weren't white. And a lot of people weren't even allowed to come into the US if they weren't white. So there's echoes of that in all of this. Oh, and there's an elevator. So theoretically you can move from the bottom to the top, but how difficult it is, it depends on a lot of things. Okay, so citizenship is at the top. It says co-op because if you're a citizen, as you know, you have the right to vote. You can co-create how you want this system to be. That means if you're a citizen, you have power. So US citizens are people born in the US, thanks to the 14th Amendment. Parents of people who are US citizens, they were naturalized, which is a process you can go through to take the elevator up. Or sometimes if you are a child of someone who's naturalized, if you're under the age of 18, you can become a citizen through them. Okay, so we're going back down to not quite the bottom, but the bottom where you walk in, the lobby. So these are people who might be coming in at the border, arriving aliens, parolees, which is a status a lot of people don't know about. But right now there are Afghan and Ukrainian parolees, which means they have a temporary authorization. It's usually like 1 to 2 to 3 years. And now there's a lot of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans who also have parole, which means they're allowed to be here. But unfortunately, for Venezuelans and Nicaraguans, they don't have access to any government benefits. So that's a problem in our work. And then DACA, I think you all know what that is. So here's the examples I just explained. So hotel rooms, non-immigrants, there's some examples. Students, migrant farm workers, people with like highly skilled jobs that, their job applies for a visa for them. Sports players, other highly skilled people, religious workers, diplomats, tourists. So the Florida Refuge or Sanctuary, this is where Minnesota Council of Churches does the majority of its work with people who have refugee status, which means that they have been overseas, often in a refugee camp for decades, waiting to be granted access as a refugee in the United States. And then there's a complicated process where an international organization and the United Nations are involved, and they fly them over here, and then Minnesota Council of Churches and other refugee agencies in the area accept them and place them in homes and are able to offer them lots of services to help them create a new life. And thankfully for them, a refugee is a permanent immigration status, so even if they don't go up the elevator, they're still allowed to be in the US, it doesn't expire, but most people do, because who doesn't want to be a citizen? And people who are granted asylum also are counted here. We don't work with them as much at MCC because asylum essentially means it's the same kind of status as refugees where they're fleeing violence or something like that in their home. But instead of waiting overseas for decades, they make their way here to the border and then ask a plea asylum to someone at the border. And then they have to apply once they're here. That means they aren't able to work for 6 months till after their application has been submitted, and then it can take years for their application to be approved. So then they're in a really tricky situation, and they're not allowed to get any help from us because of what the government has decided until after their asylum is approved. So they could have been here for like 5 years, just figuring out life on their own. So at that point, they usually don't need that much help because they've already figured out how to live here. Yeah, so that's rough. Oh, so, and some other people that we work with, I talked about asylum and refugees, but victims of torture and trafficking, victims of crime and domestic violence, unaccompanied minors, that does happen, and temporary protected status. Permanent residency. So you're moving up the elevator on your way to citizenship. Family-based visas, employment visas, diversity. This is one of the steps on the path for asylees and refugees. And then there are some other programs. I don't really know what registry and legalization programs is, unfortunately. We'll skip that part. And refugees, after 1 year, they're eligible to become permanent residents, and then after 5 years, they're eligible to become citizens. But there's lots of bureaucracy in between those. Family-based green cards. I don't know this much about this, so read this. That's the information. Okay, so I think a lot of what Daniel's gonna talk about is the basement situation. People with unauthorized status who come here because their life circumstances are in such desperation that they think this is the only problem. And as you know from the news, the United States government does not make it easy for people. There's been like a titch of progress under the Biden administration in terms of allowing people to come under parole, but then once they get here, there aren't any resources for them. Yeah, it's not good. And these are kind of old statistics, so I'm gonna skip them. The gist is that it's a lot of people from Central America, and a lot of them end up living in the US for a really long time without an authorized status. And then we kind of skipped over this, but of course there's the basement, which is immigration detention, which is a really unfortunate reality for a lot of people. And a lot of the time after that, they're deported and may or may not try to come back. I've also got some information about the refugee arrivals that we've currently had, but since we're running late, I'll just go through this really fast. This year, thanks to efforts of the Biden administration, we are hoping to welcome more refugees than we have since 2015. And among the 4 metro resettlement agencies that is hoping for 2,445 people, we're about halfway there, which has been really exciting. People are coming from all over the world. Most quarter from Somalia, and then this is really unusual too. Like you can see the rest of this graph is just like lots of little slices of different colors. Lots of people from Central America now, which we didn't used to have so many refugees from Central America, so that's exciting, like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. Lots of people from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and still Afghans who have been waiting like in Pakistan or Qatar since the fall of Kabul. And then a smattering of other places. So,
What's the royal blue piece of the pie? The large one, 6 o'clock.
oh,
That's it.
Congolese, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Yeah, so I think that's all for me, so, okay.
One of the things that you may want to know is that the refugees that the Minnesota Council of Churches resettles come through Episcopal Migration Ministries.
Good point.
Episcopal Migration Ministries is our federal partner who works with the State Department at higher levels and the Office of anyway, they work at that federal level, but they are all screened by EMM. And then those folks come to the Minnesota Council of Churches, where Chelsea and all of our other resettlement staff will connect them with the resources that they qualify for and try to get them tracked towards some level of self-sufficiency, ideally in about 6 months' time. If you please make sure to fill out the sign-in sheet if you have not done so already. So when we talk about refugees and asylees, these are folks who have access, and in some cases, humanitarian parolees. These are folks who have access to a wide range of resources, both federal and county and state resources. Housing assistance, sometimes cash, food stamps, healthcare, furniture, help getting kids enrolled in school, a whole variety of legal services depending upon what you need in that circumstance. But there is quite a range of services that refugees, asylees, and again, some humanitarian parolees have access to. What I want to spend some time talking with you about are the families who don't have access to virtually anything. At your leisure, take a look at that article that I've handed out to you. That gives you just another picture of what I'm going to be talking with you about today. As you can imagine, immigrants who come to the United States who don't have access to the range of resources, these folks are the poorest of the poor immigrants. And I think it's helpful for us to talk just a little bit about politics. Sometimes we tend to think that Republican presidential administrations are worse or more harsh on immigrants. And there is no question that especially the most recent Republican administration did some just horrific things. And that's gonna come back in spades if President Trump is reelected. But that does not let Democrats off the hook by any stretch of the imagination. So here's what I wanna just kind of paint a picture for you about deportations. Over the last 5 presidential administrations, going back to President Clinton, who was succeeded by George Bush, who was succeeded by Obama, who was succeeded by Donald Trump, who was succeeded by Joe Biden. President Clinton, during his administration, deported about 2.5 million immigrants during his administration. George Bush was right around the same. Deportations during their presidency. What was the nickname that immigration advocates gave to Barack Obama during his administration? What was the nickname that people gave him?
Deporter in chief.
Deporter in chief. Deporter in chief. Go ahead.
So I'm curious, to help us have some context
Uh-huh,
of that number.
yeah.
Like, how does that compare to, I don't know what number to compare, like the total immigration number or the total who were allowed to legally immigrate?
No, we're talking about the number of people who were deported.
Right, but how does the number of deportees compare to,
It goes from. In the Clinton administration, there were around 6 million undocumented, 6 to 8 million undocumented folks in the United States. And then today, there's approximately 12 to 13 million undocumented in the United States. Right, so the deporter in chief, Barack Obama, deported more than 3 million, the highest number up to that point in US history. How many people do you think that Donald Trump deported? Take a guess as you compare it to these numbers.
5.
2.7. Now, remember, this is over an 8-year period of time. This is over a 4-year period of time. So he was well on his way to, right, whatever that number was going to be. In 3 years of the Biden administration, how many people do you think have been deported?
3. Oh, goodness sakes.
4 plus. And counting. And counting. So, one little small snapshot around deportations. Chelsea also mentioned immigrant detention. On President Trump's last day in office, there were approximately 14,000 people in immigrant jails across the country. About 200, 220 different facilities, public and private. How many people do you think are in immigrant detention today? Not bad. 40. Under President Biden. And if you were in the 8 o'clock service, you heard that the $1.2 trillion budget deal that was just passed 48 hours ago or 36 hours ago contains money for 8,000 more immigrant detentions and 3,000 more border agents at the border. That's what the budget deal. So there's going to be more enforcement and there's going to be more detentions and of course more deportations. President Biden is far outpacing any of his predecessors on all of this. Yeah.
Is that an indication of more people wanting to come to the United States? Or is it really brutal that they're just being more brutal?
The number of people there, you can imagine that immigration cycles up and down. There are years where it's really high, there are years where it's really low. Depends on which country is, you know, in the worst crisis at the time, depends on US policy. There's, 50 factors that go into how those numbers cycle up and down. What I can say to you about the Biden administration right now is at the southern border, for the most part, families with children are being let into the country if they don't have a criminal record. Families with children are being allowed in. Single adults are not. That's a very simplistic way to describe what's happening at the border, but that's what's happening. The family that I mentioned during the 8 o'clock service that came knocking on your door here, is a family with children. And your sexton called me at home to say, what do I do? And then Chelsea and your sexton worked their magic, and now that family is being helped by the Minnesota Council of Churches. Now, we talked about immigration detention. This is a national snapshot. How many immigration detention centers are in Minnesota? Did you know that there were any? How many do you think?
Maybe 2.
Maybe 2? How about 3? Any idea where they're at?
Elk River?
Who said Elk River? Okay, yes. The Sherburne County Jail. That's right. Where else?
Redwood.
Fort Snelling doesn't count, and I'll tell you why. Freeborn County.
Southwestern Minnesota.
And the third one, Candy, Ohio. Each one of those county jails have a contract with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE pays those jails a per diem, meaning there's an incentive, fiscal incentive to fill those beds. And that's why in September, there were 108 immigrants total in these jails. In December, 116. And as of last week, 126. Don't forget this. Don't forget, again, that there's 8,000 more funded jail beds throughout the system nationally, right? Those folks are gonna end up at these county jails along with many others. So these numbers are gonna continue to go north under the Biden administration. Ramsey County used to have a contract with ICE. They got rid of it in 2018 after a bunch of folks applied a bunch of public pressure to them. The majority of these folks come through where? Where do they come through? Where are the largest number of immigrants in Minnesota? Minneapolis and St. Paul. So these folks don't go directly here, they come through the Hennepin County Jail and the Ramsey County Jail first. Because these folks are picked up for a DWI by the Minneapolis police, or they're, could be something significant, could be something very minor, could be wrong place at the wrong time and nothing's really going on. But these folks come through Ramsey and Hennepin County jails, which are what? Both completely DFL controlled, both of them. Now, these jails are not DFL controlled, but Ramsey and Hennepin are. So when you start to think about, which party deserves the most blame in this, again, very scenario of what's going on hyper locally and what's going on nationally, there is plenty of blame to be going around. Now, why is it important for you to know this?
Because we vote.
You do vote. Here's the other thing though. Let's go back here. Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. Why is this important? What do all these administrations have in common?
Well, they deport a lot of people.
They're all
They do.
white men.
They are, well, except for Barack. Every president enjoyed majority party control of both houses of Congress in their first 2 years. Every president. Clinton had a Democratic House and a Senate, Republican House and a Senate here, Democratic House and Senate, Republican House and Senate, Democratic House and Senate in their first 2 years. What does that mean? It means that they all had the votes to do something comprehensive, but they lacked the political will. Why is that important? This is why we have to get moving here in St. Paul. Because there is no national solution anywhere on the horizon. So what we do here in relationship with our friends and our neighbors and other churches and the Minnesota Council of Church and all these folks who are, staunch immigrant advocates, nothing is happening here. Don't hold your breath. We have to get going locally. We have to. Especially with this next election, with so much writing on this next, on the next election. Not that things are any picnic today. Now, again, if you were in the 8 o'clock service, you heard about a new initiative. Partnership between ECMN and the Minnesota Council of Churches. All right. Back in 2018, 2019, 2020, we organized a campaign called What Would Whipple Do? It was an immigrant justice campaign to urge the federal government to take Bishop Whipple's name off of the federal building. And there were some other initiatives around some policy changes. Those policy initiatives are still happening. But now that there is an influx of families with children, again, I urge you to read that article that's in front of you. These are folks who don't have access to virtually any resources. They cannot get work permits, not any time in their first 6 to 9 months of being here. They have to figure out a way to live from the time that they arrive to the time that they are allowed to potentially get work permits. They can't get food stamps. They can't get health care. They can't sign an apartment lease. They can't. We're letting them in. We're letting them in and giving them no ability to take care of themselves. What would Whipple do now? Hi, Susan. You know Reverend Susan Moss?
Oh, yeah.
Of course you do. What would Whipple do now? The partnership between the Episcopal Church in Minnesota, staunch blessing of Bishop Loya, and the Minnesota Council of Churches, whereby we are going church to church. So it is no secret why I'm here today. We're going church to church, denomination by denomination, to say the poorest of the poor need our help. We started this at your sister congregation in Linden Hills. They created a team of 25 people, 25 volunteers, who agreed to work with me, Susan, Archdeacon Reyna, Rex McKee, the deacon at St. John's Linden Hills. We formed a leadership team, so that group of 4 of us are kind of the leaders of this initiative to train folks just like you to accompany and support these families. Now, we can't accompany all of them, right? The need is just too great. But we can accompany and support some of them. St. John's Linden Hills is supporting 4 families. 12 people, 15 people, Susan? Something like that. They are paying for rent. Linden Hills, St. John's Linden Hills is paying for rent. They're providing Aldi food cards every month. They're paying phone plans. They're helping kids, school-age kids, get enrolled in school. Susan took a couple of our kids from those families to the dentist last week. We've got some pretty significant dental bills coming up. These are the kind, and we're of course trying to create community. Now, we can't do this forever, right? We can't support folks forever. So what we're thinking of is the Minnesota Council of Churches will work with a refugee family for about 6 months. About 6 months. And so that's kind of the model that we're working off of. There certainly will be families who become self-sufficient in less time. Some will take more because of a variety of different circumstances. But my invitation, our invitation to all of you and to anybody else who you know, whether it's from St. John's or neighbors, friends, is to come back here on April the 20th from 9 to 12. I think we're gonna do it in this room?
It looks like it's available.
Okay. We're gonna do a training for you, Susan and I, Rena, Rex. We're gonna do a training for you about what it takes to accompany and support these families. We get calls every day. Every day. And right now, we've organized one congregation to support 4 families. We would love for you to be the second congregation in our What Would Whipple Do Now campaign. In order to pay for those phone bills and those rents and those Aldi cards and the dentist appointments and all of that, Linden Hills raised $25,000 in about 2 weeks. They've set a pretty high bar. But we are, in addition to bodies, to real people, taking kids to school and taking families, because right, these folks can't drive. They can take the bus once we show them how to use the bus. But we've got to have folks who can drive these folks around and who can just be friends with them. You have an afternoon, gosh, how about getting to know one of these families and taking them out for ice cream or pizza or bowling or, and that's what Linden Hills is doing. So we're kind of following their lead. They're working really well. Susan's working really hard to kind of coordinate a lot of this. And once we train you, we're going to ask you to make some kind of a commitment. We encouraged folks to think about 5 hours a month. Don't have to sign a contract. It can be an hour and 15 minutes a week. It can be 1 5-hour stretch. It can be however you want to do that in helping to support a family, both with time and treasure. So that's what's going to happen on April the 20th. Where is St. Anne's?
Sunfish Lake.
Sunfish Lake. They're going to be here on April the 20th, right here, with you. So that this would potentially be a joint Sunfish Lake, St. Paul thing. Excellent. No problem there at all. We need some folks in the room. So that's the invitation, is to consider coming back on April the 20th. We're gonna figure out how to get some coffee and donuts and those kinds of things. But again, from 9 to 12, probably right here in this room, you'll be hearing more about this over the coming weeks. I'm gonna stop babbling, ask you if you have any questions about or any reactions to anything you've heard before we sprint back for the 10 o'clock service. Yes,
So I'm just wondering with these families, so through your connections, they're finding housing, or is that already set, or is that part of the what needs to be worked on as well?
both and.
Mhm.
Both and. There are some landlords that we're working with who have agreed to rent to these folks. For the most part, just based on our word that we're gonna take care of their bills for some period of time. But there is, of course, an incentive on their part, on the part of the families to find work, and several of them have. None of them have work permits, none of them qualify for work permits. But families do create their own kind of resilience and their own kind of resourcefulness. That does happen. We help them a lot. We help them a lot. But their own resourcefulness is really an amazing thing to see as well. Any other questions?
How's your Spanish? Mine's bad. And you know that Spanish is just one of the many languages that come through, I'm sure.
Right, there's different levels of Spanish fluency, among our group. I'm probably a 7 or an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. Others are 2 and 3, everybody else uses Google Translate.
It's amazingly.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my personal cell. You have any questions about anything that you've heard, anything that you're curious about, call or text me. Text is, I'm a little bit more accessible by text. Please do take a look at that article. Just came out a week ago or so. There are many more just like that related to the Minneapolis Public Schools and the number of Central and South American kids who are enrolling in public schools in the Twin Cities. And on and on and on. You've all been great. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us. Last question.
It's an observation from a week ago when I was one of the volunteers at Project Home. And many of us have done that for a long time, and now you go and help prepare a meal. And usually it's quite a broad spectrum of folks. This last time, for the first time in my experience, I would say 80% were Spanish speaking. And even the children didn't speak English.
Right,
So that indicated that they were recent arrivals,
right.
family groups. And one thing I'd add, they didn't take any cauliflower.
Right.
They liked the other food, and that was just, whoa, that was too scary for them.
Don't let the
It's
language,
interesting.
don't let the language barrier get in the way of your curiosity and your generosity.
So I think
The
that
language-
program has changed, and I think their new executive director is Latina.
Good.
Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. But I was very struck by that. So anybody who speaks Spanish might think about
Project Home
volunteering
as
at
well.
Project Home.
Yeah.
To support your comment, I was very involved with our DRC immigrant family and have seen a French Swahili,
Right.
and it's not an issue, but you simply work through it.
Right. You've been great.
Thank you.
I'll see you in the